Good evening, and welcome to WANA Live, the reading series of the Writers Association of Northern Appalachia. I'm your host, Damian Dressick. This is your other host,
Christina Fasonic. What's up, Damien? Not to put you on the spot.
What is up? You told me it was week 4 of the semester.
It is. It's the end of week 4.
So there's that. And there's that.
So papers are rolling in, and we've got like 4 more weeks until midterm. So we're a third-ish, a fourth-ish, I guess, a fourth away from the end of the term. So we're a quarter of the way in. And now this is when the work, I always feel like you can kind of coast for the first 3 weeks, and then after that, you've got to work hard. So, yeah. So we have.
Be careful telling people that they'll claw some of your money back. The coasting penalty.
Oh, well.
Coasting charge.
In the era of this modern university system, that could be true. I work so hard every day of the semester, including day 1.
Absolutely.
I'll go back and edit that later.
All right. So we have a guest tonight.
Absolutely. Yes, we do. And I'm really excited about our guest. I've been wanting to have them on for, it feels like forever, but I always, how our booking works. And so I'm so glad finally this happened. So Zane McNeill is a scholar activist from West Virginia. And, I've got to put in my West Virginia in there. They are the editor of Y'all Means All, which I think everybody in our audience has heard of this book or read pieces from it. The Emerging Voices, Queering Appalachia from PM Press. We love their press. I remember meeting them and talking with them at ASA when it was in Morgantown and loving their work. And the co-author of Deviant, Hollers, Queering Appalachian Ecologies for a Sustainable Future, which is forthcoming from the University of Kentucky Press, which I hope we can also have a little bit of a chat about because they're doing awesome work there. So let's bring Zane on.
Hi, y'all. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, great to have you on. So tell us about this work. And we were talking before the show and how I think we're kind of breaking through the surface to get more voices out from Appalachia. And this is part of it. And people and presses and the audience is ready for this.
And I feel like we were saying earlier, it's really a deliberate effort, right? There's been this historical silencing of these voices, this really big focus on this one dominant narrative of what Appalachia is. And I feel like finally presses are giving room and space and platform for authors from tons of different backgrounds in order to show that, there's not one monolithic way of being an Appalachian or what that looks like.
Yeah, which is exciting to us because especially being from the north, in northern Appalachia, we've been fighting all along saying we're Appalachian too, and always getting some pushback. Well, you don't talk like us, or you have things that we don't have, and what about Pittsburgh, and things like that.
Let's not say we've always gotten pushback because we've definitely had a lot of allies and a lot of great people in the South that have been supportive. I don't want to ignore those folks. I'm not saying you're not right, but I don't always is a nervous making word.
West Virginia is the only state that's completely encompassed in the Appalachian region. And especially after, J.D. Vance's book and the 2016 election was really scapegoated by progressives and media pundits for saying, well, it's actually Trumpalachia. And so this book really comes out of that moment, but not just wanting to be defensive and reactionary towards that moment, but building something else out of it.
Yeah, which is great because I feel like a lot of amazing work came out of the response to Vance. Kat's book was amazing. There are other books out there that were just, and The Bitter Southerner ran a number of different pieces that authors were like, we don't recognize the Appalachia that J.D. Vance is talking about. Like that's not what are you talking about? That's not who we are. But I agree. I think now we're finally beyond the reactionary moment and starting to create an epistemology, a new meaning making out of modern Appalachia.
And I feel like especially in 2018, when I started doing this work around queer in Appalachia, there was maybe there was Ray Geringer's thesis, a few other pieces about it, but there wasn't any work on it. I mean, Jeff Mann had done a few things, but otherwise outside of a few pieces that came out of WVU Press when I was working on it, there wasn't a space for that because our voices weren't there, right? And then Queer Appalachia, with all of its messiness, showed up and gave a lot of platform for queerness in Appalachia. And now it's a whole canon, right? I posted on the Teaching Appalachian Culture page something about my book, and they're like, why is everything queer now? Which is hilarious, right? Because 2 or 3, 4 years ago, there was nothing out there. And it's not because there's not a queer community that is survived and thrived throughout our cultural history, but because there wasn't a platform to archive these voices. And that's something that I feel like we finally now have people behind us to give us that space to tell our own stories.
Yeah, which is very cool. By the way, I'm the owner of that Facebook group, Teaching Appalachia, and I saw that's how I contacted you.
It's so funny because I mean that is so wild because other than maybe 4 or 5 books, it's still a very big developing space, and so it's so much further than we were 6 years ago because of the hard work of queer and trans authors and the press and publishers behind and supporting us. But I mean, that's certainly not all of what critical Appalachian studies is.
Right. Yeah.
That's so really cool. You were talking about telling stories. What are some of look, I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the book itself. Do you have a copy?
Not yet. So it's still going through copy editing. So I don't have a physical copy of it, but it's beautiful. The cover is from Jamie Miller, and it's one of the prettiest book covers I've seen. Of course, The All Means All was a gorgeous cover too. So my friends are always very jealous of the covers that my books somehow managed to get.
Cool. So tell us about the book.
Yeah, and we had spoken a little bit earlier about maybe also reading a section. So I might read something from Stephanie Foote from the forward. But Deviant Hollers, a little background in the book is that it really I started thinking about it the same time I was working on Y'all Means All almost 6 years ago. And I was thinking through the importance of queer voices and queer narratives, but also how the Appalachian region itself, right, is seen as backwards or used by folks outside of the region, either through cultural or environmental extraction, as a sort of sacrifice zone, which my co-editor, Rebecca Scott, has written a lot about. And something we are really focused on is how, even though there was this really big push, right, this erupting, emerging queer scholars in Appalachia to queer the region, how that's still engaged with settler colonialism, right? Appalachia is a settler space. And so you can't really queer a region that's not mine, right? That's not ours in a lot of ways. And so when we're trying to think through the entanglements of environmental extraction and settler colonialism and capitalism, we really felt that we had to come from this point of recognizing how settler colonialism really warps all of that. And that's where we come from this book, thinking through not just Appalachian as a queer region or queer folks in the region, but also how it's embedded in these histories of extraction and genocide as well.
Well, did you look at like people like Richard Slotkin? Was he a voice that was interesting to you, or?
So we've had, I don't think I know them particularly, but a lot of our work comes from mostly English and critical English studies, as well as we have some voices from geography and sociology, film, and then one of the contributors as well does oral history.
Wow, that sounds really awesome. So it's interdisciplinary at its heart.
Yeah, and I feel like it's important with all of my work is just like there's no one way of being Appalachian, that it's really important to have different kinds of disciplines to frame these conversations. And so we have a whole myriad of different scholars and activists from different spaces. So not just this focus on activist scholarship, which I think is really important, but also bringing in frameworks and conversations with each other around what econormativity is in Appalachia, and doing more than just queer gender studies as well to have these conversations.
Yeah, no, that's really cool work. And I feel like it's what we were talking about before the show, about how you have to step away sometimes from home to critically see home. But I think that seeing home from all of these different disciplines gives such a bigger picture than just looking at it from one area of study or another area of study. But you really see, oh, well, what we're learning about in sociology and how we're learning about it in environmental science. How do those things fit together? What does the oil and gas industry have to do with, not just the land, but also these communities that are built by people that weren't born in the region, that didn't originate here, but they're coming in from outside? And how does all of that shape who we are? Because they're part of our community, even if it's for a short time. So,
and I feel like this book also focuses on stories and telling stories of people who, aren't contributors, but their experiences, just like the people who work on the Mountain Pipeline, protests in Yellowfish. And so we have two filmmakers actually, and as well as an oral historian that really try to archive these stories in their own different ways, in conversation with these other fields, which I think is really interesting and different from other collections.
That's really awesome. And I was going to ask that question next. So how do you think this new work fits with Y'all Means All? Do you see it as an expansion of that or as something new? Or
it's interesting because they both came from the similar space, the same time, like in around 2018 or so. And then some of the contributors are the same, but they have progressed a lot because a lot of people, when they started with Y'all Means All, were first-year PhD students. Or master's students, and now they're finishing, their PhD or finished their master's or PhD. And then I feel like Y'all Means All it came out of Queer Appalachia because we had met in that space on Instagram, and there was finally a language, right? Because we had never seen ourselves in queer spaces. We knew we were queer, but that was very metronormative, right? We didn't identify with this what queer was in New York City, right, or in San Francisco. And so when Queer Appalachia as an Instagram space existed, we finally had words that we could use to describe ourselves and build community. But so much of these scholars came out of that space, but they were still, thinking through what it meant to be queer and then who they were. Y'all Means All is really about identity, I feel like. And Deviant Hollers is, I feel like, more these scholars and these voices more mature in a lot of ways, not just thinking through personal identity and geography and space, but how these conversations are embedded in larger histories that have also been erased. So not just saying, hey, we're here, we're queer, right? But recognizing how even saying that, devoid of these understandings of settler colonialism, really ends up being harmful, right? And so even though so many of us were really empowered to show that we existed and that there was a history of existence, and we're critiquing all of these hierarchies and everything else, but really saying we can't, even though we want to queer a region, it's not ours to queer in the first place. And this book is really exploring what that means and trying to think through how we can build futures, not just around Queer Appalachia, which is something I was really passionate about, but also being accountable to the harm and the erasure that's happened in the region as settlers in Appalachia as well.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So you want to read a section for us? We would love to hear it. Do you want us to come off the screen, Damien?
Why don't we disappear and
we'll come back.
Let's say give read from the book. That way people can get a sense of what it's about.
Yes, we'll be right back.
Thanks, y'all. Yeah, I'll go ahead and just read part of the foreword by Stephanie Foote, because I think that gives a really good start to the conversation of what this book is about. So the history of Appalachia is not, as contemporary progressives believe, the history of Appalachia's inability to understand its own interests. The history of Appalachia is where the United States' contradictions, like its reverence for local cultures and its desire to exploit them, has been most efficiently worked out. Appalachia has been the site of some of the worst resource exploitation in the nation, and its impoverishment has made possible the everyday political stance that wonders, from positions on the left and the right, why Appalachia seems to consent to its own poverty. But as you will see in this collection, a number of Appalachians are pushing back against conventional narratives about Appalachia. In particular, they are focused on the larger meaning of extraction. What does it mean, for example, that the region has provided raw material and human power for the nation's grids? Even now, when the coal mines have largely been automated because of mountaintop removal, the deepest ones closed forever, Appalachia is still the site of resource exploitation for fracking wells that poison water, soil, air, and land. And finally, of course, Appalachia is now much in the news because it seems to have a ready supply of purchasers for opioids. The much reported on deaths of despair have hit Appalachia hard. Unemployment, disability, chronic illness, high unemployment rates, and the lack of opportunity for educational and class advancement have made the region, for reporters from major newspapers, the perfect site for devastation wrought by addiction. No surprise that Appalachia has been understood as one of the last holdouts for Donald Trump, for white supremacy, and for conservative politics. If Appalachia is Americans' political other, just as it was once in favored regional wild child, its perceived politics of racial and class resentment seem hard to fathom. Why, liberal news outlets asks, does Appalachia vote against its own interests? Why does it support candidates who are clearly in the pocket of the very corporations that have decimated it? There's no shortage of think pieces in newspapers and political blogs about Appalachia's self-defeating poverty and politics, and all of them rely on a flat understanding of what Appalachia is and wants. Stephen Stoll and Elizabeth Catt have each written powerful books about the complicated histories and politics of Appalachia. And yet for liberal and progressive critics, it's all too easy to think of Appalachia as uniform and in need of salvation from itself. But as the essays in this volume argue, Appalachia is significantly less in need of salvation than, say, exploitative corporations are in need of prosecution. Nor is it in need of restoration or return to the primeval natural world that can be enjoyed by urban elites, as with the establishment of the new national park in New River Gorge, the site of Hawks Nest tunnel disasters in the 1930s. It's easy to see that Appalachia is implicated in larger structures of exploitation. It is harder to see that virtually every part of the United States is implicated in Appalachia's exploitation. Its history is the history of the U.S. empire, writ small and large. Its internal contradictions are those of the very heart of imperial ideology. Yet the question of what to make of Appalachia, what constitutes it, what accounts for its apparently self-destructive political attachments, what binds the region together, is not answerable if we think of Appalachia merely as a sum of the wounds it has sustained, the total of what journalists imagine as its resentments or insularity. Neither is it answerable if we only consider the landscape and the intense connection Appalachians have to the region. All of these ways of getting to Appalachia as a place, as an identity, as a political or economic zone of impoverishment and extraction are partial and incomplete, and they all attempt to impose unity on a region that is structured by as many internal differences as any other region. Appalachia is not just white, not just rural, not just Republican, not just poor, not just straight. But what does that mean in practice? The essays in this collection together imagine what happens if we queer Appalachia. The project of queering Appalachia is politically useful. What happens if we think about its oddness, its difference from everyday national structures of power and belonging? What new forms of collectivity and identity might become apparent if we think about a relation to power that queers the utility of normativity? But it's also useful if we think about queerness demographically. What happens if we think about Appalachia as not simply made up of straight and cis people who stay and queers who migrate away? What happens if we see the world of Appalachia as enlivened by queer social actors? What Appalachians have, how Appalachia have queers built and sustained, changed and empowered? What histories have queer actors shown us? What futures do they direct us to imagine? Such considerations allow us to see that Appalachia is not simply white, not simply straight, not simply homogenous. And finally, what happens if we apply the lessons of queer theory to geographic place itself, to look at the way that queer theory can illuminate the relations among the subjects who live in Appalachia, their love for the decimated natural world, and their reliance on the extractive economies that have ruined it? When we queer Appalachia, then, we embark on a project that does not promise a unified idea of what queerness is or what the shape of an emancipatory queer politics looks like. But queering Appalachia, challenging the key terms of how subjects, agency, and desire are related to one another, promises the way that we imagine relationships of power can be changed and remade, because every iteration of things are as they are is deeply historical and thus available for revision. As the essays in this collection argue, Appalachia, which has been the site of so much fantasy and so much exploitation, has always held within itself alternative ways of knowing its relationship to power. We just have to listen. Thank you.
That is so smart. I really, really love that. I mean, I think one of the arguments I've made for years is somewhat aligned with that outside of Appalachia, that all these interests, they want to blame us for everything. You're poor because you're lazy. You're a drug addict because you're lazy and you want to use drugs. You're this, you're that. And I've always believed it's because the rest of the country, did not want to take responsibility for what they have done to Appalachia.
And I feel like Meredith McCarroll has done with thinking about Appalachian whiteness as racialized itself, right? You can't disconnect that from capitalism, from extraction, from racialization and white supremacy, right? It's all entangled in the same thing to create Appalachias and other that can be extracted from, not just our mountains, but our people as well, right?
Sure. And I think what a great thing to talk about our new park, but also think about that from the perspective of the Hawks Nest tunnel disaster. I mean,
Stephanie Foote is just a wonderful scholar and thinker. I was so thrilled to have her be part of the collection. And I feel like her forward really does offer just such a great way to lead into this discussion and this conversation between scholars, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of times, people think, well, I don't want to read a book about queer people or queer ideas. What does that have to do with me? I'm not part of that crowd or whatever. But I think that this forward sets up why this is important, like why everybody should want to read a book like this if they're interested in better understanding Appalachia and the context with the rest of the United States.
So, yeah, and I feel like so much about, like, Y'all Means All, like I was saying, is about identity and agency and archiving and finding histories, like rediscovering histories, right, and thinking through futures. But this book is really using this queer approach to how Appalachia is connected to the other world, the rest of the world, right, the rest of the nation, and using that as a way to think through power relations. So it's really not just queer as people and actors in the space, but also a way of thinking back to power.
Yeah, I mean, that's so compelling. And I think a lot about the third space and how we've had this disappearance of third spaces and how we need to reclaim third spaces. And that's what I was thinking about while you were reading. Like, this fits in with that idea that these places where we can be together, discuss ideas, disrupt notions about politics and power and all of these things. We need to have those spaces to have those conversations.
And I think what's so powerful of this book for me, why it matters so much to me, right, is it because queer matters to all of us, right? Not just for those who identify as LGBTQ, but what this book is saying is that we have to think through these power entanglements in order to find not just liberation of ourselves from extractive capitalism, but also really undo the own ways we are implicit and complicit in white supremacy, right? And our own subjugation through holding power of this land, right? And so this book is important not just for queer folks, but really everyone with an interest around Appalachian and the region, not just how it got this way and what narratives are happening about it, right? And what the power is behind that, but how we move forward, not just to be accountable to this harm, but building power between all of us.
Yeah.
So when is it coming out?
So it should be out at the end of March, early April. I'm really excited. And I'm actually having book twins, and so is Becky. So together we're having book triplets. We have 3 books coming out at the same time between the two of us.
That's awesome. And this is from UK, University of Kentucky Press, right?
Yep.
And we were talking about this before we went on the air. University of Kentucky is one of the presses that is really allowing and creating spaces for the multitude of voices and ideas that are in Appalachia. They have new series coming out, new books. It's awesome.
Yeah, and this book is part of their Appalachian Futures, Black, Native, and Queer Voices, which I really recommend everyone just going on that and getting every single book in it, because it really is trying to focus on these historically marginalized voices in Appalachia that have caused some of these narratives, right? Of what is Appalachia? It's white, it's poor, and why that is. So really challenging those normative understandings of the region.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I cannot wait to read this and share it with other people. And it sounds just incredible.
Yeah, we're really honored to be doing it. I mean, it's a labor of love from the past 6 years. So it's had a very long journey. And all of us have really grown into, I think, some of our best works in this book. And I mean, I've written with a lot of these scholars in different places. We had a Journal of Appalachian Studies special issue that I've written with some of these folks. We had other chapters that I've written with these folks. And so these conversations that are in the book are part of a larger conversation that has been happening between all of us for the past 6-8 years. So really happy to see it out in the world and bring other people into this discussion.
Super cool.
We know that you won't be at ASA this year, but is there any chance this book might be?
It will, yeah. So I heard that even though it's technically, I think ASA is happening before it's out, there will be books there. My editor told me. Yeah, and then I'm pretty sure Becky, the co-editor, will also be there. So be sure to tell her hi as well and grab one if you want. You can hang out with my editor, Abby, who's amazing. Used to work at WVU Press.
We know Abby.
Just an all-star.
We know her too. So wonderful. We'll definitely stop by the UK table and see what's up over there. So thank you so much for spending time with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to see more of what y'all do and be back hopefully in the future.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for doing this work.
Thanks a lot. And thanks everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, we'll see you next week. Same time, 8 p.m. Good night.
Bye, y'all.